Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Birdhouse. Excellency, representatives of the international organizations and non-governmental organizations, ladies and gentlemen, and you following us online. There are many of you, 180 people following online. Dear friends, we're very happy to welcome you here this afternoon as part of the International Day for Children in Street Situations. My name is Mario Fetz. I am the Secretary General of the International Fondation Apprentis d'Auteuil. The Birdhouse is a restaurant that's quite different. It's an integration restaurant that provides young people with diplomas, young people who have dropped out of school. This year we have 15 apprentices working in the kitchen or front of house with trainers who are following them and a coach and educator. You will have the possibility of talking with them after the conference and above all this evening. And hopefully you will all be able to stay for the third conference, the last conference, which will be followed by a buffet and drinks. So you will be able to taste the specialities of the Birdhouse and have a chat with the apprentices. So we're starting this second conference today. So there will be a summary given by the moderator later on. And I just wanted to point out that she's already online. So you can follow the conference online. It is recorded like the one today. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to Tony Burgener, who is the moderator for this conference. And can I invite the speakers to come up onto the stage as well, please? So I'm going to hand over now to Tony. There we are. Thank you very much, Mario, for those welcoming words. So as Mario has said, I'm just going to summarize what happened yesterday because it was a memorable evening. And I thought that it was a great start to the 2 days. It was a challenge. They set the bar very high. Hopefully we will be as great and concrete with our debate. So yesterday evening, for those who were here and people following online, so we kind of set the scene with respect to the issue, why these children are in street situations. So that was the first question. And the answer was clear. There are multiple reasons why they find themselves in street situations. And then after that, we talked about how we can try and support them, help them in one way or another. And very quickly, we're going to move on to the subjects for this afternoon that we're going to look at in detail. The role of families. You can see the title of the debate for this afternoon. Families and children, agents of their own change. So families, on the one hand, that's something that we focused on last night, but also the young people themselves who need to be agents of their own fate. And that's something that we'll be focusing on, what requirements there are. You know, it's important to allow them to speak to, and it's important that they become aware of their own potential, what they're able to do, so that they're not forgotten. Today, with our speakers, who I will be introducing shortly. So the first speaker we have is Professor, just a moment. Let me just find my list. Carl Lacharité, who will be following us from Quebec online, from the Trois-Rivières University, where he is a psychologist and professor, no, the specialist of this field, especially when it comes to the involvement of families in this issue. And as a professor, he's carried out a lot of research, and he'll tell us more about that, share some of his knowledge with us, so that we can look at the psychological aspects of this question. We mustn't forget psychology in all of this, even if, you know, sometimes it's difficult for us to recognize the psychological aspects of this situation. We also have a child psychiatrist with us, Dr. Nicolas Liengme, who is here with us in Geneva and who is familiar with the problem of facing young people in the streets, in street situations. He's also the co-founder of an association in Geneva, and he'll tell us more about that. He developed a different, a technique, a method to help young people to find their voice. And we'll hear more from him later on. It'll be great. And then on my left, we have the specialists from Apprentis d'Auteuil who are very familiar with the subject. We have somebody from Paris who manages and coordinates this subject, and that is Christophe Beau, who is in charge of that issue in Apprentis d'Auteuil. And then we have somebody in the field. It's always important to go into the field to understand, real experience. And this person is called Madeleine Tiendrebeogo. It's a difficult surname to pronounce, but Madeleine will talk to us about her experience in Burkina Faso, where she manages a family house and where, it's something that she sees every day. She can influence the fate of the families, but also the young people. So you can see that we've got a great podium with different types of experience, different points of view, and that will make for a great debate. Just to illustrate the first part, let's focus on the young people themselves, young agents, young people. So we've got a short video to begin with, and this is a video based in Peru, where there's a project that applies this concept of young people, taking on board their own destinies, being their own agents of change, young people who find solutions, or help to find solutions. So if I can ask the technical team to put the video up, and you have the subtitles in French and English for the video.
Y también soy parte del equipo de dirección de Qosqo Maki. La Asociación Qosqo Maki es una institución creada para hacer labor social. Es una institución sin fines de lucro que tiene como fin fundamental crear el dormitorio Qosqo Maki para acoger a niños, niñas, adolescentes, trabajadores en situación de calle. Nuestra idea es la de que ellos tengan un espacio libre, abierto, para recibir un acompañamiento adecuado a su situación y puedan reintegrarse de manera progresiva a la familia, al seno familiar, a la sociedad en sí. Pueden estar circulando en todos los ambientes, ¿no? Conversando, socializando desde el comedor, la cocina, la lavandería, el gimnasio. También pueden pedir entrar a la biblioteca donde puedan socializar con jóvenes del barrio de su misma edad, donde puedan también interactuar con adultos del barrio o de otras zonas. Es un espacio reflexivo, de socialización y de interaprendizaje. Hay una particularidad en el trabajo socioeducativo con los niños, niñas y adolescentes de la calle. Es que cada uno tiene un ritmo diferente, cada uno tiene una forma de ser muy particular. Intentamos darles un poco de orden, un poco de organización, de disciplina a esta situación que ya está planteada. Manejamos el dormitorio con los usuarios de manera horizontal. Esto es una herramienta que nos permite justamente medir el desarrollo de capacidades, medir el desarrollo de habilidades de los usuarios en la medida que se van involucrando cada vez más en la convivencia, en las actividades. Una vez por semana, los días martes, a partir de las 8:30 de la noche, tenemos una asamblea de usuarios del dormitorio. Es ahí que los chicos, los adolescentes plantean una agenda. Entonces es a partir de ahí que nace todo un plan de trabajo, un plan de intervención educativa, un plan estratégico para abordar tal o cual situación que se ha presentado dentro de la convivencia, dentro de las actividades internas y también fuera del dormitorio, porque hacemos acompañamiento en sus espacios en la calle. La cogestión es muy importante para ellos porque así aprenden a llevar a cabo actividades, ya sea con sus pares o también con otras personas, ¿no? Que sepan manejar situaciones, que conozcan en detalle las situaciones y que también puedan darle alguna solución, alguna salida. Y esta es una herramienta muy importante que les va a servir para toda la vida. Hay una problemática de trabajo infantil instaurada en nuestro país desde hace muchísimo tiempo, así que ellos se van trazando objetivos. Es necesario, por ejemplo, si ellos generan ingresos económicos, que tengan ahorro, que sepan cómo gastar el ahorro. Los principales desafíos que se le presenta a los jóvenes para su desarrollo, para obtener autonomía, independencia, es de justamente qué herramientas tienen o con qué herramientas contar para empezar este proceso. La herramienta muy inicial, muy antigua que tenemos en Qosqo Maki desde la fundación del dormitorio desde hace 35 años, que es la caja común. Como son chicos trabajadores, ellos tienen ingresos económicos, ellos manejan una economía y es por eso que a partir de ese ingreso se han organizado en una caja común, en un aporte voluntario a una caja común. Entonces ellos aportan para que puedan tener algunos beneficios, ya sean individuales o también colectivos. Entonces en ese sentido nosotros vamos organizando junto con ellos la disciplina, la administración de sus ahorros, la administración de sus gastos para que puedan tener una idea más clara de cómo llevar una economía en base a sus ingresos y en base a sus necesidades. Ahora también es importante que los objetivos que se van trazando para su formación técnica, profesional, pueda también ser cada vez más cercana al sueño que han tenido. Los acompañamos para que ellos tomen la mejor decisión, para que ellos puedan optar de manera más cómoda a una formación técnica, profesional, que se acomode a sus intereses, tanto educativos, profesionales y también personales. Quienes van a tomar la decisión final para ver qué les conviene con toda la información que se les brinda son los propios jóvenes, porque son los que al final van a llevar adelante estas decisiones. Para eso necesitamos mucha socialización, necesitamos darles mucha información. También se trata de darles confianza, de darles seguridad. También recibe este tipo de aprendizajes muy interesantes. Es decir, el aprendizaje es mutuo, es interaprendizaje y de eso se trata. Los jóvenes también tienen mucho que enseñarnos.
Voilà, je trouve que c'est un témoignage qui était extrêmement riche.
I found this testimony very rich. He's the educator in this association, and he's a partner of the Apprentis d'Auteuil in Peru. I think it's a good basis for our discussion. And now I'm going to ask questions to our different panelists, but I encourage all of those of you who are online to prepare your questions and use the chat function to ask any questions. They'll be sent up to me. If you ask them at the last minute, I might not get them on time. So I encourage you to ask them as they come to you. And in the room, you'll have the possibility of asking questions also. So I'd like to start by
expanding the framework with Carl in Quebec, in Trois-Rivières, Trois-Rivières. We talked about this yesterday quite widely, the importance of giving a voice to young people, to work with them at their level, and to give them the means to start to have projects, to dream of something new. But at the same time, we know that they're in very precarious situations, sometimes in distress, and they need to develop survival mechanisms. From a psychological point of view, how can we approach these children and try to help them on self-direction or co-direction, co-management? I'd like to start by saying that psychology is the study of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. This science allows us to formulate a project that leads us to approaching the experience of people and of approaching the development of this experience. And thus, psychology offers us methods to go into the experimental and subjective world of the children who are very young, older ones also, and teenagers. Psychology allows us to begin a dialogue with young people, with children, based on how they attribute meaning to what is happening to them, and how, in the framework of dialogue, do they have the possibility of existing by expressing themselves on this topic. So Michel Foucault gave a definition of the experience, which is the act of understanding one's own area for speech within language. So how can I exist as an individual within a context where there are several things that I have to deal with, that I have to take ownership of and transform in order to exist? The fact that we pay attention, that we take children's messages seriously and young people's messages seriously, that's really important in developmental psychology. What does it mean? Taking into consideration what children say. It means, as we saw with our previous speaker who described their project in Peru, it means what are the spaces, what are the moments that we give to the children to allow them to express themselves? That's first element. Second element, what support do we provide to these children to allow them to express themselves, to speak? And in psychology, we know that speaking is very linked to thinking. How do we support children's speech? This also means how can we support their thinking about the meaning that they give to their experience and to the world around them. But we also have to take into account, in the way children speak, we have to look at the sounding board. Who is going to listen to them? How will it be heard? How will it create resonance around them? One of the problems is that children will constantly want to express themselves, but they're not getting any feedback to their words and to the meaning that they're proposing. I'd just like to go a bit further. You talk really well about the approach that we should have with children, but we're going into the private sphere, into their intimacy quite deeply. How can we manage that? As an adult, we're not at the same level of these children, so how can we have contact? How could we break down some barriers to achieve that and win their confidence? So tangibly, how can we do this? Tangibly, one of the first things to do that's important is to remember our own childhood. Try to remember within our own spirit, our mind, what it's like to be a child, what it's like to be a child who's afraid, who's angry, who's sad, who's happy. And so the first source of contact and dialogue with children comes from ourselves. And that's inevitable. What we must then do is use our imagination, because we can't base everything on our own experience. We have to be able to imagine what the life of a child is like, the child that I could be living with in my own family when I'm the father or the mother. I have to have that ability to imagine what their little life is like. So when you're with children who are in street situations, we have children whose relationship with adults is difficult, it was broken. And so we need to use our imagination to understand what it's like to live that child's life and how I appear to that child when I'm in contact with them. Once we've done this work of remembering what it means to be a child, of working with our own imagination, there are all kinds of elements that are available to us to start the conversation. Starting the conversation could just be being present. Carl, thank you. I'd like to get feedback on what you've just said from Nicolas. So on one hand, yes, we are in contact with the child, but now, how do we give them the strength? How do we encourage them to develop their capacities? We had some good examples yesterday of kids who have skills and talents and who want to do something with it. How can we put this all into perspective so they can do this? Thank you for this question. Thank you, colleague, for your comments from Trois-Rivières in Canada. That's one of the challenges in psychiatry and psychology. The working with a child in an environment that is not just damaging, but that carries hope. And we need to be aware of how dangerous the streets are in the medium and long term. But if I come back to the street and what the street represents for the child, at first, it can allow the child to imagine a better life. They're running away from a very difficult situation, usually family situation, where there were strong links, but even if the child is still connected with the family, the fact that the child goes into the street, it's because they're looking for something better. So we need to treat the pain that the child is experiencing. They can find strength in contact with other children and other teenagers and people in street situations, including the professionals who are there for them. The street is a very dangerous place, but when you see what goes on in their own families, we realize that they're maybe better off in the streets because they're more open with the social workers and other people. So aligning ourselves with these children, as our colleague in Peru said, who had this great presentation, we have to be able, as the professor said, to put ourselves in the place of the child with our own references, with the child that we have within us. All psychiatric health professionals have to be in contact with their own inner child to help children. So we have to be able to recognize the virtues of the street and the movement that they have made to be in a better situation. And as educators, as social workers, we have to try to understand and have a posture that's not too directive or interventionist, which is often a trend from a lot of social work. As an adult, when you come in the street and you see children living in the street, you really want to find solutions to get them off the street, and you have to fight against this desire to act immediately, which would cause us to lose the essence of the contact with the child. As the professor said, we have to understand the meaning of the child's life. If we want them to move forward, we have to look for this meaning, and their life in the street and leaving the streets has to have meaning, and we have to work with them without being too interventionist. Or else, if I can talk about one of my own projects, we need to divide the educational approach and the psychological approach. There have to be people who protect the professionals in the socio-educative world have this task to protect the child, housing them, feeding them, etc. And the psychiatric teams, when they're present, they can work with the socio-educational teams, create shelters where there are less instructions, fewer expectations, and this coexistence of different approaches is an excellent one. Well, so that was really interesting. We talked a lot about psychiatry and psychology, and the separation between the psychological side and the educational side, which is the specialty of our colleagues from La Fondation Apprentis. The approach with young people in street situations more generally, not necessarily. What are your principles? What's your concept at Apprentis d'Auteuil to take into account the situation of these children? We're talking about children in street situations. So to allow children to speak, you have to listen to them, you have to mobilize them, then you have to analyze the situation that they're in the streets. So what is the approach of Les Apprentis d'Auteuil? I would say that the world in which the children are living in the street situations, but all children in general, we experienced it, and it's important to reconnect to our inner child to have access to them, but it's a world that escapes us when we become adults. The best way to have access to the world of these children is to interest yourself in their daily lives, what their lives actually are in reality. Carl was saying earlier that there's a need to help these children to have access to their thoughts, to be able to express them. Having access to a thought to express it requires some conditions. And I wanted to say that the first condition for a social worker is to leave room. As Nicolas said, we tend to occupy the terrain because we want to act, because the position of the rescuer is quite easy when you're a social worker. You want to save the people that we're in interaction with. So the idea is to ensure that the first agent is the child, and the child who's teaching us. The child knows things that we don't know. And if we want to have access to what they know, we have to learn how to ask the questions, how to show interest, how to be curious with this child. So to be interested in their lives.
Ses relations avec ses amis, c'est ses relations avec sa famille, c'est ses relations, c'est ses intérêts, c'est ses talents, c'est ses ressources, c'est
their interests, their resources, their suffering, their combats, their struggles. So that's what it's all about. So, you know, any social problem, you know, that's what we're trying to do with our partners internationally, but also in France. We're trying to have a kind of humility in the way we approach these children. If we come along as an expert, at saying what would be good for the child, we would probably get it wrong. Thank you, Christophe. So Marie-Madeleine, what Christophe has said, we have to push these children, get them to say what they have to say. In your family home, your family house, you give them a space so that they can express themselves. How do you go about this in your context? We'll come back to the family house a little bit later on. You'll understand what it is a little bit later on. But let's just continue to focus on the young people and the children. So in our family house, they have a space, somewhere where they can come together with their family every day, so that there's a link between the parents and the children, and also between families who don't know each other. They come along, they meet up, and they become a single family. So it's important to have a link between parents and children as well, because this is important. In this family, so when they come along, the children are free to tell their parents about their problems, and the parents see what their children's problems are. And the children come to the house, and they also talk with other young people, with other children about their problems. Some have dropped out of school, for example, and they talk to each other. They share examples. They discuss together. And so the families see that their children need to talk to them. But as we're talking about African families, you're not allowed to talk to your mother or father in this way. So this is a way to help them talk directly to their parents and to solve problems. And so we'd like to thank the Apprentis d'Auteuil, because it's thanks to the foundation that we can bring the families back together. The children are in a vulnerable situation. And it means that they can meet other people that they wouldn't otherwise meet, and to create ties, very strong ties. They can, in fact, go and help other people cultivate. They are all part of the same family, and they can cultivate together. And the children go back to school. They say, I had dropped out of school, but here's a family helping me so I can go back to school. So we'll go back to the details of Marie-Madeleine's project. So there's a video that will explain all of that to us. But before that, let me come back to the young people, to the children in street situations. So we've been to Africa, but here we are in Geneva. And here the situation in Geneva is what concerns you. So there is this issue here. And that's why you created your association and your project, your method for managing, for capitalizing on what their worth is. Yes, so I had experience 25 years ago in Brazil, in fact, and I had this experience with my co-founder. We developed a project in Brazil. It was a psychological project where we wanted to create a space for free speech. We worked with children's dreams and their imagination. When we're talking about pre-adolescence or children during the latency period, it's important to create spaces, because they're still, where there can still be children, where they can be seen as what they are, seen for the backstory. And it's a space where they can reconnect, not just with the future. It's, to be able to think about the future, you have to be able to reconnect with the past. And that might be painful. Sometimes they have to break away with parental figures, mothers, fathers, and that's why it's great to hear from Madeleine and to hear about their families becoming close again. In Sao Paulo, the link with families is difficult, and to draw a parallel with Geneva, because that was what the question was about. So having followed this experience in Brazil, the objective is to provide solutions to children who are in a very precarious situation or in street situations. There are children like this in Geneva, not very many, but there are many who are 18 to 25 years old. And we also have children, young people from Africa, from Algeria notably. So we're talking about 16, 17, 18-year-olds who come to our association, Païdos. There are problems with addiction, with lots of different drugs, problems with trafficking, human trafficking. Sometimes young women are involved in this trafficking, but other times young men. So they are really suffering. They have psychiatrical problems. They have a problem with their identity. That's what we see. That's what we saw yesterday in the conference, in fact, with our colleague from the United Nations. You know, children in street situations are not delinquents, she said. It's important not to think about them and to put that label on their heads. So these are symptoms. They're looking for an improved situation, but they find themselves in addiction systems, in trafficking systems, and we've got to help them to get out of that. And it's very difficult. In Geneva, there are about 10 or so minors who have been taken on board very well because with the governmental departments and other associations like ours, we've been able to create a shelter for them, a housing for them. They can come during the day, but they can also stay overnight when they prove that they are still minors, and that's something that can be difficult. Now, the big difficulty, in spite of everything that we can offer them, the different possibilities we can offer them, the problem is keeping them in a place, making sure that they calm down enough so that they can start projects and go back to training. They've got to accept the help, but the pain of their past, and it's called lipomania. There's a kind of, you know, a permanent research, a permanent excitation. They don't want to fall back into depression and anxiety. And very often, you know, they move from city to city, that they, but you know, we working with French associations, Spanish associations, who go and work with children who are looking for well-being. Their life expectancy is not good. There are many who die along the way, many because of drugs, because of violence. It's very difficult to offer spaces where they can kind of settle down and breathe more easily. So this is a tool. We use the self-portrait method with psychological support. Sometimes it's a project that they're interested in because we suggest that they talk about their own past, their ideals, their dreams, via a playful tool that allows them to introduce themselves with their own story, their own dreams, their own projects, using video tools. So, for example, a 10-minute video clip where they talk about themselves. So with the camera, they can go and film in places that are important to them. And when they have pictures of their childhood, we can work with those, and that helps them to work on their childhood. So it's reconnecting them with their own past, with their own history, and it gives them a sense of themselves. It gives them a sense of their identity. These are subjects that allow them to think about the future, because they're in a very difficult situation psychologically. They're in the streets in Geneva, and there's a specific problem with this. Each country, including in Peru, they ask for specific requirements, because according to the place, the culture, the precariousness, we heard about children being treated as witches. So for each group of children in street situations, there's the problem of culture. You have to adapt the methods. And one thing that is constant, you need this space for expression. I think good educators, and this is what we heard from Qosqo, there is this opening, this recognition of the identity of the children, of the teenagers. That's absolutely fantastic. It really is a very important idea to explore. We forget about it. There have been decades of attempts to help these children, but that's what was missing, this opening up to identity and recognition of the child or teenager's past and history. I think little by little we're introducing better practices where we're focusing on recognizing the child, not just their pain, not just the psychological aspects, but often there are things that we have to mend for the child to be able to move forward. Carl, so you have tools probably as well, you share approaches, but can you have an impact on these young people? Are there any concrete examples? And I will ask you the question as well. Are there any concrete examples that we can use, with specific results? That's a very important question that you're raising there. It's a question that requires us to think about what we consider as a success in the actions that we implement for these young people. Let me just tell you about what's happening here in Trois-Rivières and the way we approach this specific issue, described so well by my child psychiatrist colleague for Geneva. Here in Trois-Rivières, we consider that the street is a space where you can live. So it's a space where you can live, occupied by young people, not just individually. They have a collective life in this street, and inside that space, there are intermediate spaces. So it's not just the street that makes up their living space, it's also these other places, intermediate spaces. The person from Peru described one of these places that welcomed young people for a day or longer. What we do here is we consider that the action to be implemented is collective. For example, we invite the young people to work on collective projects about their vision of the world, about what's at stake in this living space. And we use methods like, for example, the photo voice method. The photo voice method where we ask these teenagers to take photos of what's important inside their living space. And then they come back together and they assign meaning to the pictures that they've taken that represent important things for them. And then we look at how collectively they can create a path that can be for different people in Trois-Rivières. So there's this collective element, there's this dialogue between a space, the street, which is occupied in a very intense manner by young people and who want to get into contact with other people who occupy adjoining spaces. So this is our approach. The objective is not to send them back to their families. The family can become an intermediate space for them. And it can be an indicator of success, maybe the fact that they can, while going back to their family, find something. But for another young person, going back to the family, it has nothing to do with what we might consider as a success. So Christophe, when you hear this, given your activities, success for you, how would you define it at Apprenti d'Auteuil compared with these young people? I'm not sure I can really answer that question in such an immediate way, but what seems to me to be important to be able to succeed, to make sure that these young people can think about their world and talk about their world and be heard, you know, the sounding box that Carl was talking about. This requires an awful lot of creativeness on behalf of the field workers, and this is what you know, the self-portraits offers.
I've seen this in Africa and in other places, places of creativity around games, forums. There are certain programs that allow children to have dialogue, to be able to share. So this requires that the adults that we are who are working with these children, these young people, we have to force ourselves to widen our fields of intervention, the way we look at this, to offer a theater of expression to the children that is consistent with the way that they express themselves. We see that video games can become a place of expression. Sometimes as adults, we consider that it's something that we should be banned, that we should ban. But if we don't go into their world, if we don't enter it, we're going to cut ourselves off from the possibility of hearing what they have to say to us. So it's up to us to adjust, to adapt to the way in which young children express themselves. The children don't have to adapt to the way that we would like them to speak. So we've seen that the young people are taken into account, and then the families, which is essential in all that. We heard this yesterday. Families play a role. That's not maybe the objective, as Carl said, to reintegrate the children into the families, but at least the families are there and they can be important and useful for prevention. And that's the second topic that we want to address now. I just remind our friends to prepare their questions. I'd like to get them fairly quickly so that I can ask them. So we'll be moving on to questions in 15 minutes. So we have a short video from the center that Marie-Madeleine works in, and she'll explain a little bit more in detail how they work. So I'm happy about this initiative. It's great to implement the project. It's helping us a lot. For 22 years, Marie-Madeleine has been working with other women, Kogl, Taaba association, training young girls who are not at school and young women with financial difficulties. They have courses on dyeing, sewing, weaving, making soap. For greater impact, the association has been working with Apprentis since 2021. Apprentis is a foundation in Paris. I hosted a project run by the foundation, which is going to help us provide our families with more. The families we help are vulnerable. Most of the time, it is the women we help who are in charge of their families. The project supports the families already on our list and other families in the town of Koudougou. I'm getting help from the project Maison des Familles. The project started 10 months ago. I've benefited from many things, such as food, school supplies. We also receive training. Meetings are organized with the families so that they can go to get to know each other. We receive advice about caring for our children. I learned to weave here, and today I train other women. We sell what we produce. It's a source of income for our trainers and learners. My children, my husband, and me all benefit from the project because what I earn here is for my family. That's Marie-Madeleine in the center in which she's the director. So it's a help center. So we're talking about families in vulnerable situations. How do you define vulnerability with respect to children in street situations? Is there's a direct link between vulnerability and the situation that the children find themselves in? If the family is unhappy, if they don't get along, or if they don't have the means to take care of the children, they're vulnerable. And when we host the families in the center, they learn to sew, to weave, and the family thrives, and they come with their children. They learn a profession, and there's also more traditional education. They learn to read, and amongst the women, they can talk about the problems that they're experiencing, and we provide support. For example, to help them get their identification for their children. They're often not registered when they're born, so we help with that with the town halls and the social service department. So we can help them establish the documents that they need. The young people meet and talk about their problems, and they're always in a group. The women also, they organize activities together, and then the men together, and then we bring the families together. Sometimes we've managed to reconcile families where there has been discord, where the parents were not getting along and the children were unhappy. And this leads the children to live in the streets and maybe start stealing. So the father might be hitting the mother and the children can't bear it, so they want to leave. So in the families, no one's speaking to each other anymore. So we try to act to bring these people together, and we get them to talk to each other, and they can find solutions together. And this is something that we work on. That really describes the prevention aspects, the importance of the family, and how you can try to get them away from the vulnerability. Do you have a tangible example how a young person was able to succeed thanks to the work that you've done with them? I have a young family, a woman who lost her husband. She had 4 children, and the children were ill. So the mother was asked to leave the house because her children had a mystical disease, and the mother was isolated with her children. The children gave up school. They were discouraged, and they were just locked up all the time with their mother. When we opened this family house, they came, and the educators, the social workers meet with them. The young people who were no longer talking to others anymore have now integrated. They're happier. They all needed to talk. They all had problems they were keeping to themselves. So in this in our maison de famille, this family learned to speak to each other again. The other children who were there helped them find solutions. And we're not talking about small children, we're talking about young adults, and they come and they back and they say thank you. There's a child who stole a chicken. He didn't know what to do, how to eat, and he was sent to prison. And the family would go visit him all the time. And he said, when I leave prison, I'll come and integrate your center. He won't steal anymore. So it's great to see that these projects have their impact. This is a concept that's new at Les Apprentis d'Auteuil, these family houses. Can you explain the origin, where it came from? and what you base this concept on. 10 years ago, there was a meeting between institutional actors, the Apprentis d'Auteuil, with women who were alone bringing up their children in France. And this led us to create a first Maison des Familles in Grenoble. These women said, we're alone to bring up our children, and the fact that we're alone makes it much more difficult to educate them. So we became aware that there was a need to create opportunities to meet, to share, to support these women. I often talk about women because they're often mothers with the children who are involved. So this house was created. It's an area where for shelter during the daytime, where women, mothers, fathers can come and talk with other parents about the challenges that they're encountering, with social workers who are working with them and whose main mission, it's a difficult one, it's to identify the weak signals, things that can be said in a very delicate way, but they're very significant for these families, to then create a project with them. The idea is to co-build answers to their needs, the needs that they have. This started in 2009. In 2011, there was a meeting. I turned to Carl. He was a major actor in the development of these houses. I met him in 2011, and he talked about the same concept in Quebec that had been started 30 or 40 years. There are 300 Maisons des Familles in Quebec, so they're much bigger than we are. So we co-built with them. We fed our projects and we enriched our practices. And today we now have 20 of these houses in France. The families that we work with in France, we see that their problems are the problems that all families have across the world. Education, living in poverty. Poverty is the most structuring phenomenon of the difficulties that families have today, because it humiliates them, it discredits them, it disqualifies them. And so the Maison des Familles, if I can talk about what characterizes them, it's a space where people could come and find dignity again. Marie-Madeleine explained this. People come to find their dignity where it's been not respected. There's an Israeli philosopher who says that a decent society is a society whose institutions and communities no longer humiliate. And these families are often the victim of a lot of humiliation. So we created Via Familis. It's the Maison des Familles, these family houses on an international level. We experimented in Africa, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Kinshasa and Congo, and in Asia with Cambodia and the Philippines for more than a year now. So it's time for questions. I don't know if there are any questions in the room. Who would like to ask a question? Otherwise, I have some that came from our friends online. So think a first question for Carl.
Finalement, on a entendu des familles, et puis je sais que vous êtes Christophe vous a bien montré, j'espère qu'il est un bon élève à vous, par rapport à tout ce qui est le concept qui était mis en place.
I hope Christophe is a good pupil, given what's been set up. So here's the question. How can we get away from the vicious circle of child labor? Work could be part of the street situation. Yes. And I think that Christophe has really put his finger on, you know, the pain point. So the thing that means that children work, and that is poverty. So inside our communities, we implement means and structures and places, spaces that allow the people to live a dignified life, even if it's not really the life that corresponds to the criteria of wealth that we might have inside a country. So this means that the family is the place where it's possible to be rich thanks to your experience, where it's possible to live a dignified life. Now, of course, where we act in a very direct fashion when it comes to child labor. It's not the only factor, but in research and in studies carried out by scientists on this issue, we know that there's a very close link, close tie between poverty, collective poverty, but also family poverty. No, and often that's not the same thing. And this phenomenon of children being exploited, child labor. I have another question for Nicolas. It's important to take what children say seriously. This is what you said, you explained it. But we know that young people often don't say everything about themselves. How do you manage that kind of thing? Now, two answers. Yes, what children say has to be taken seriously, but you have to be careful because children in street situations have developed a way of speaking that allows them to survive. So the first thing that you hear in the street is not necessarily what's going to correspond to their real needs, to their being, because, you know, because they're in contact with the broader society, they have to adopt a way of speaking that, you know, that creates empathy in others so that they can have help. So it's important to access to to find the access to the other discourse that they might have. For example, when you're working with 8, 9, 10-year-olds who are in street situations, sometimes the reality, you can see it through games. So you have to play games with the children, not board games, but, you know, role play, drawing. That's what we do as psychiatrists, not necessarily with children in street situations. We find out who they are not through what they say, because what they say, you know, it picks up speed the more contact you have with them. And what was the other question? Sorry. Well, we know that young people can't always say everything about their story. How do you deal with that? Well, for that online follower, that's a good question. You have to develop tools, mediation, therapeutic mediation tools, the self-portrait that I was talking about with psychological and educational support. So the educators help the child to co-build their being so that they can connect up with the reality of their thought. But our colleague from Trois-Rivières talked about photos. That's another therapeutic means of mediating. It's a great project. It ties in with society. Through the photos of the children's street situations, you can raise awareness. In other words, the environmental culture of these children is a determining factor for their future. So it's important to raise the awareness of society concerning the issues of these children in street situations, not just because it's intolerable, that situation, not just because you have to fight against poverty, not just because you have to find the right people to help them. It's important to raise the awareness of the population so that you get to something that's more in line with their identity, their hope, their vision of the world. We talked about them being agents of change, agents of their own fate, so that they find their own place, not just in their close group, but in society generally. And as an association, that's something that we can do. We can help using the experience that we heard about from Trois-Rivières. We heard about other experiences, Marie-Madeleine, but also Nicolas. You know, it's important to hear what these children in street situations have to say. So it's this question of identity, the perception of children. That's what we're going to be talking about in the first half of the second debate, where there are other speakers. I have another question now. This is for Christophe. So the training of educators, and you're an educator working with children in street situations, does it necessarily include a psychological aspect? Does it cover psychological questions? Yes, I think it's necessary to have at least, in fact, here again, you have to differentiate what's happening in European countries or Western countries and what might be happening in countries where you don't necessarily have training centers for social workers. We know that there is a lack, a shortage of training for many workers in countries where, because, you know, there is no training. So at Apprentis d'Auteuil, we're used to helping social workers across the world. We propose training. We have training modules. And in these modules, we focus on different things. You know, how to understand the development of a child, for example. That's something that we look at. We also look at the position of social workers when they're providing support. You know, it's very delicate, this work, being a social worker. And this allows me to say that in many places, perhaps in European countries as well, it's a job that's not very well recognized. And I've often heard in Africa, for example, that being in charge, managing children in street situations is not a dignified job. So, you know, so this means that the people who do this kind of job, who should be recognized, and if then we had the, you know, it's like the pandemic, you know, the people on the front line were not recognized enough. And this is the same for social workers in Asia and in Africa. It's like people, because it's because the people are not, they're not, you know, worthy of being supported and helped. And therefore, those who help those people, those young people, they're considered in exactly the same way as unworthy. And, you know, that's where the stakes are so high. It's almost systemic, in fact, considering children in street situations in one way, it means that you consider the people who help them in the same way. So here's the last question from our online listeners, and then we'll have some questions from the people here. So this is linked to what Christophe was saying, Marie-Madeleine. What is the situation of these children in the streets more concretely? What are we actually talking about? And, you know, do they have a certain job? Can they possibly go back to school? Can you just give us some examples from Burkina Faso? What are you really seeing in the field? Well, in Burkina Faso, all of the children in street situations, well, we take them on board with their families. So we allow them to come and talk and tell us what they want. Yes, if I can just interrupt you again, what is the situation of children where you don't succeed? You know, when they're in the street, these children, this is what the online listener would like to know about. So what is the situation of the children in the street? Yes, perhaps they don't have any work, perhaps they might be at school or not. Well, their situation, it's like other families in other countries. It's not a good situation. but because of associations, they can learn a job. We've trained people from children from street situations. We've been able to extract from the street and to learn a job like sewing. And what about for boys? Yes, for the boys. Yes, I'm talking about the boys. Okay, yes, sorry, sorry, I'm biased. Yes, so it's usually the boys in the street. So they leave the street, they become tailors. They're happy about that. They're very happy to come and learn. But it takes a lot of work because even approaching them is very difficult. These are people who they take drugs. So you have to, first of all, be able to approach them. You have to talk to them about the benefits of being with the others, because when they're in street situations, that they're angry with everybody. They've fallen out with everybody, with their family, with society at large. No, they're not happy with society. They say that everybody's the same, and so they do stupid things. But when you get them to come in, they become autonomous. They're happy. So it's about training. It's about learning to read and write, and they go back to their families, and their families take them back. So with such a testimonial, we should really be able to conclude, but let's take another question from the room. Can you just introduce yourself and then ask your question and tell us who the question is for, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Franca, Fille de Lacharité, representing the NGO with the United Nations. I'm just 2 weeks old in Geneva. I have listened yesterday and today. I don't have a big question to ask. Any question I have is what I must reflect and find the answer for myself. Because very often there is the aspect of depending on others to answer the question for us. But sometimes the power is within me to find my question and to try to answer it. I want to add to what Maria Madeleine has said towards the question of the situation of children on the street. The situation is quite complicated. You need to be in the system to understand what exactly it means for a child to run to the street. One of those reasons, poverty is just a small part of it. Within the family system, death of a mother or of a father can lead the mother or the father to find a new spouse. So when this new spouse comes into the family and maybe has some sense of jealousy of what is happening with the other children that were there before, she finds a way, or he finds a way, to create some kind of situation that will force children or the first wife or first husband to go to the street. About 10 years ago, I carried out a study of children who were being accused in Nigeria of witchcraft. And that's exactly what was happening to most of those children. Death of parents within the family. I have watched videos where single individuals stepped into the system in Nigeria and helped a child, to become something. Some children that are found on the street, when they are quite intelligent, they can get up to university levels. Especially in Nigeria, we have a lot of that, those kind of children, but they need the help. Sometimes the answer I give to myself is that we must do something about training families, children, for civil responsibility. I have worked as a missionary in London in the past 6 years, and I see how children from primary level are trained into civic responsibility. So we have a lot of work to do in our African situation, because one day there will be a donor fatigue. It is there already, where you are not able to get fundings from international organizations again. And yet within African situation, we have very rich people who could help. But there is this double standard where the children of the rich, they go to the best schools. The children of the poor are left in public schools where teachers are not paid and therefore they are not taught. So how do we bring a balance to this kind of situation?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I would like to thank you. It was a very good and very concrete testimony, and I think this concludes perfectly well our session here. I think there are other questions, of course, that come up during the next debate, which also go a little bit in this direction. What else needs to be done that we can find a solution, maybe a big word, but find an approach that the situation is improving. This will be more or less the content, very globally speaking, of the next debate. But thank you to all our guests here, to Carl, to Nicolas, Christophe, and Marie-Madeleine. I think it was a very dynamic, it was a good debate. I hope you have learned, and I think the most important is what Nicolas said, that we have talked about this issue, that we have had the possibility to have you here in this room, and the 180 people online from 12 different countries, if I got it right. So I think it's a nice way, or an important way, to bring this topic on the table. And this is thanks to Apprentis d'Auteuil, and I pass the floor to its General Director here in Geneva, Maria.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tony. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup à notre modérateur, Tony Burgener.
Thank you to our moderator, Tony Burgener, who moderated the discussion with a lot of panache. Thank you to our speakers with all of their know-how. Thank you to Carl Lacharité from Trois-Rivières. And just quickly, it wasn't the topic, but I heard about trainers and the fact that not everyone has the same opportunity for training. And Apprentis d'Auteuil has developed a concept called digital notebooks. That's very complete training. We have several modules. The first one was for unaccompanied minors in France and in Europe. And we've given the tools to the educators to learn, taking step by step. Not everyone has the same training, so it's very practical training. We are currently developing the digital notebooks for children in street situations in the countries that we've already talked about. So this module will come out soon, in the next 6 months. And this is where we'll see that educators that didn't receive the training that we have in Europe will be able to connect and exchange with others. And so we'll have the famous multiplier effect. We will train up to 2,000, 3,000 educators across the world in a very interactive manner with these modules. So thank you to the public, to the audience. Thank you to people who are following online. And now we're going to take a short break, 40 minutes, and at 6:30, we'll start our third and last conference of these 2 days. And it will also be moderated by Tony Burgener with other guests. So we'll take a quick break and please be back at 6:30 sharp. I hope that you'll all be able to stay, especially since afterwards you're invited for a cocktail served by our chef and our apprentices, and so that should motivate you to stay. Thank you, and we'll see you later.